So how many people here have heard of quantified self?
Okay.
Wow.
There's some hands who don't.
We can go.
Good.
We can go.
Yeah, yeah. I think we should call people up and have them talk about it.
So I want to. That's good to know because I want to know how much background to give. But basically, before we get started, Gary and Kevin were two of the core figures in starting Wired. But that is irrelevant in many ways to why you're here on the stage, because what you guys have cooked up recently is this idea of quantified self and just helping form this community of people doing this thing. So I want to let you start by describing what is quantified self and how did it start? What is the origin story of QS?
The origin is two parts, because we each came to it with a slightly different idea. My side of it was I run a site also called Cool Tools, which is about all neat stuff that you can use to better your life. And I was on a walk with a doctor friend, Dr. Alan Green, who actually is here, and he was doing an experiment where he was eating only organic food for a year. And I was asking him if there were any tools for testing his own blood to see whether that was going to show up in his own blood. And we were lamenting the fact that there wasn't any kind of tools for tracking your own self. And so I thought that it would be a great idea to start something that would start to track the kind of tools that you could use to track your own health and body, because there wasn't a good site that had all these kinds of things. And then at the same time I had that idea, Gary had a different strand, which you can explain.
Okay, well, I think part of that, for me, relates to the fact that when I wrote stories for Wired in the beginning, Kevin was my editor. And so when I got done with sort of taking on sort of line responsibility at Wired, I wrote stories for many years. But the thing that stuck in my mind from that experience was Wired sort of built a culture around technology. It was about how we participated and how we thought about technology rather than about the technology itself. So I came to Kevin at the same time he was thinking about tools, and I said, you know, that was really fun. That was sort of 2 decades worth of work building cultures around technologies. What are the next questions that we should ask? And we did a kind of very straightforward exercise. We wrote some technologies up on the board. I remember personal genomics and geolocation was up there, and kind of ubiquitous computing, and we drew a circle around them, and we did an editorial job, and we said, what is this called? And if you name something, you have to name why it matters. That's what you're trying to name. And we said, well, this stuff is sort of about the language of computing, counting rather than sort of guessing or estimating or intuiting. So kind of quantification, but it's about bringing that all the way in, bringing computing just so close that it's almost indistinguishable from yourself. So, okay, quantified self. It's not the most euphonious name, you know, but it's a descriptor. It's an accurate descriptor. We said, well, let's write about it. Let's do a blog or something like that. We wrote a few things, and Kevin said, let's gather some other people who are thinking about this. We put up a little announcement on Meetup. About 30 people came, I remember, at your house, and this is the most amazing moment, I thought. Some guy walks in late. We're having beverages. We're about to introduce ourselves. Kevin said, OK, you came in late. You go first. So instead of like giving a little discourse, the guy just, remember Yaping Li, yeah. He just opened his computer and showed us the most amazing visualization of every minute of his time over the past, I think, year. Right. And he said, OK, well, this is who I am. You know, I'm going to show you something about myself rather than tell you something about myself. And that the light bulb went off, I think, at that point. That was more interesting than writing a blog or writing stories. It was sort of capturing the new emerging culture of technology in the wild among the people who are actually doing. And so now we have about 70 groups in 15 countries, and it's very much a place and a context where we can get a sense of the human side of these new tools.
And this started about 5 years ago, is that right?
2007, I think, was the first conversation, yeah.
Right, so the growth of it has been amazing. I mean, the community that has catalyzed around it, this idea is extraordinary. I mean, you see people, you go to other conferences and they're referencing quantified self as if people should know what they're talking about, and this conference does. But what are the kind of core principles that you guys have devised out of this?
So we've been very careful not to try to define it too carefully. Basically, we say, if you think you're doing quantified self stuff, you are. Come show us what you're doing. But we actually doing many, many meetups over and over again for these past 5 years, in some cases almost monthly, other cases not so often, in the Bay Area it was monthly. And we evolved a set of heuristics that actually are really good for running a little meetup in terms of understanding what we're trying to do. And actually Gary came up with these three little principles that we use as kind of the guide for deciding what we want to talk about. And you can in us articulate.
What did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn?
So it's very utilitarian. In other words, this idea that this is kind of a tool-based view of the world. This is what the origin was like. Hey, there's tools there. If there's not tools, there should be tools. And what are people going to do with these tools? So there wasn't any kind of a larger sense of people should live by numbers. That was really not it was more like something is happening with this new ability. People are taking this new ability to measure everything, as Rick was saying, not just us, but all these devices, all this stuff. We can do something with this. What are some things we can do with it? And one of the things that we're going to do with it is we're going to measure ourselves. And so then that's what the meetings have been about. Who's measuring themselves? And it turns out that anything that you can possibly think of measuring, somebody in the world is tracking it right now. And we had a QS international conference just about 2 months ago, and I said to Gary, is there anything in the world that you don't think someone's tracking right now?
I had to really think.
You had to really think.
I said, I don't know anybody. I've never heard of anybody tracking how long their toenails are growing, how fast they're growing, right? So but that was the only thing I could come up with.
Right.
You know?
Earwax.
Oh, good. Now we've doubled the number.
So at the QS conference, I said, there's nobody in the world tracking their toenail growth. And then this guy raises his hand and says, I am. So the idea is
why is he doing that?
We didn't get to it. We were like, if we could get him to give a talk, we would find out.
How are you doing it? Why are you doing it? What are you learning?
And in the meantime, we've had so many experiences where we've seen people developing systems to make it easier for people to kind of track themselves, right? And one of the things that we feel like we have to contribute to that work, that's such important work, is you have to give people a chance to generate the question, not just to find the answer. So imagine the world of computing in which all we had were menus, and the only thing you could do on the computer was sort of select from the menus that somebody had thought that you might want to, do this thing. No search boxes, no querying, no ability to customize. This would be a really sad version of the world. Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do is trying to provide a context where you can sort of hear the questions, articulate the questions, understand what is this universe of question asking, and maybe even put yourself into that situation where you get to kind of state your own question.
So there was a model that you were going by in the history of technology. Obviously, Kevin's an expert in the history of technology, but this was one that was particularly acute.
Yeah, when we started this, we started it again, we really launched by having meetups, an open meetup, and we called it the Quantified Self User Group. And the model was on the homebrew user group in Berkeley, which started at the very dawn of computers and personal computers, at the time when you basically had to make your own computer. So you couldn't even buy them. This was in fact, the two Steves, Wozniak and Jobs, were kind of involved in this group where people were coming and showing off the things that they'd made and figuring out what they're going to use it for. I mean, it was a very similar kind of a state. So we had the model of the user group, and that's how this is being run so far as show us what you're doing, tell us what you're doing, telling us why you're doing it, help us inform each other about what we can learn from doing it.
And so what are some of the things, we talked about toenails, but I mean, what are some of the other things that people are tracking that are I mean, that people are finding out real things, right?
Yeah.
There's real knowledge being created here.
I mean, there's so much. I mean, in a way, we could do this. We can also do this in like Q&A because there's only one way I found to capture sort of this intense excitement that's going on in the community right now, which is to kind of get people who are curious about it to express themselves about what they're interested in, like what do you want to know about, and then I can almost always put it in contact with something that's going on in the community. But if you just wanted to make a list, you can make the list in your own head. Anything that is trackable is being tracked. Heart rate, also heart rate variability as a measure of stress, EMG off the muscles, EEG, ECG, steps, of course, with digital pedometers, activity level in general, sleep, phases of sleep, location, social relationships, mood, really almost anything that people care about is being turned into something that can be sort of interrogated using numbers in the broadest sense.
And you, Gary, I remember talking to you about it once, and you thought that the best way to measure for people to self-evaluate when there's not an inherent data point, when it's not a blood value or something,
right.
when it's say for mood,
sure.
That it's a 3-point scale is actually the most useful. Is that?
Well, this is for me like this is kind of I think Thomas, what you're doing, which is really great, is this is the knowledge exchange we do in the in the community. So one question people have is, well, what's the right scale to use? Mm-hmm. Okay, one guy uses a 100-point scale to measure his his restedness. And somebody else might say, but wait a second, how do you know that your 67 today is the same as your 67 yesterday, right? So there's a lot of work being done as people sort of share best practices. Yeah. What I like to offer in that particular conversation is I think a 3-point scale is terrific, because I think most people, in my observation, care about the extremes. So a 3-point scale sort of doesn't give you access to a lot of nuance in the middle, but you know if like 3 is very good and 1 is very bad, and then there's this sort of very undefinite 2, you get to capture the goods and bads. And one of the things I've seen in people's self-tracking is cognitive load is a very big problem. Like even the cognitive load of saying I have a 5-point scale and I'm not sure whether I should mark this as a 3 or a 4 is enough to kind of interrupt sort of some kind of process of self-interrogation. So I think this is hard, interesting work that's going on in the community, is finding out what really works to support people's tracking practices.
So one thing I'm curious about in this environment is how much of the tracking should be active and participatory, like somebody actually doing it, versus this other world we're going into, or a related world, where it's just being monitored for us. How much do you have to be cognizant of the tracking?
And I think that is an inherent tension within this regime, which is that you want to make tracking as easy as possible so you don't have to pay attention to it, and yet oftentimes the benefit comes from paying attention to it. Yeah. And so there is this sort of balance that we're doing, and one of the ways that I think will help us get through that is by having artificial intelligence pay attention to things. So if we go back to the model of the home brew club and say, well, the quantified self is still at the period of being the early computers. And what's interesting about the early computers is that if you look at how much cultural penetration the early computers did, it was very little. I mean, in the end, what did personal computers do? They were kind of like word processors. That's okay. There was some desktop publishing. That's all right. Music filing. It was actually not very powerful, and nothing really happened with computers until they were married to the phone, until the internet. That's when all the cultural bending, that's when the force of personal computers came. By themselves, they weren't so strong. And I think in the quantified self, a lot of the tools we're talking about will have a limited kind of effect until they are both brought onto the internet and are brought together, and also I think until we have some kind of AI to give attention to those things that are the data that we're accumulating, that huge universe of data that we were just talked about, and then alerting us when the patterns are there, putting on that red light or giving us a green light, and so that it's bringing us to attention when we need to have some attention.
Because sorry, go ahead.
Well, just that Kevin took us back to this moment when you couldn't really figure out what a computer was for, in a way, and people thought, oh, these things are going to be really amazing. You could kind of see it, like in this context, with an analog to a group of people like this. You could see it, but you couldn't quite see how. It looked so obscure. It looked so difficult. It looked so geeky. I mean, we were in these conversations at the time. I mean, well, people are going to have to learn to type. Yeah. Nobody's going to do that. Like right there, if you don't get rid of the typing, you're never going to have a widespread computer culture, right? You can't.
You're too slow. No one's going to, you can do things faster. Just call up somebody rather than.
Exactly. Call somebody.
Point is people did learn to type.
People, of course people learn to type,
yeah.
you know, and of course they became faster, and of course, yeah, you know, people would say you can't take it into the bathroom with you, or it's too heavy, or when it crashes, you can't get it fixed. But this was not the place where you had to look, really. Where you had to look was, what is it for? You know, are people being driven to use this because it has real personal meaning? And when that happens, these things get fixed.
Right. Well, so one thing I want to ask, because this is a question that you guys get and I get all the time, which is a lot of this numbers, a lot of data makes people very anxious, right? And especially so if it goes into the calibration of where you want to alert people. But for instance, people with diabetics have been monitoring themselves for decades, and they find it to be a great source of worry and anxiety rather than one of self-empowerment. So how do you guys look on teasing out that riddle?
So I think that in the long term, we'll probably want to bury the quantification, the numbers. I think the quantification aspect of it, in terms of data coming out, will remain, but we're just not evolved to deal with numbers. We're not very, our brains aren't really good for dealing with lots of numbers. We don't do statistics very well. We're not really a number animal. And I think, but the data is going to come in. But what I think the long-term direction of this is that we want to use these sensors that we're talking about to give us new senses, to equip us with new ways to hear our body. So what we're trying to do is to listen to our body, but we don't have very good tools ourselves to do that. We can't really hear or see my glucose levels. We can't really measure our heart arrhythmia. We are imperceptible to those. And so what this is doing is giving us some way to generate data. Right now we have to see them in data or charts or curves, but I think in the long term where we're going to is we want to be able to feel or see or hear them. And I'm thinking of a great hack in San Francisco, a noise bridge hack. These guys took the digital compass that you kind of find in your phone that will tell you which way is north, which is generating data, and they took a belt and they took little piezoelectric vibrators and put it in the belt in 8 different positions, and then the belt would vibrate in the north direction. They buried the little digital compass into the belt. So as the guy was walking around, his belt was always vibrating north. And very, very quickly, he had an unconscious, intuitive sense of where north was. So that was a new sense. He was feeling north. And you want to be able to feel these new dimensions that these sensors are going to sense. So it's kind of like getting a telescope or a stethoscope that would now be able to hear your rest level, and then you would be able to feel it in a certain sense, and only when you needed to. And I think that's the long-term destiny of where we're going with this. The numbers are an impediment right now, but just like the early computers were. You had to build your own. You had to know electronics. But we can get beyond that, so that we can actually kind of bury those numbers.
So and at that scale, when it goes to that level of a new sense, that's a bigger deal. That sounds like a bigger deal to me than just tracking some basic biometrics, right? I mean, that is a we were talking about this on the phone, but that's a shift of a much greater magnitude in terms of the scale of human possibility or potential.
Right.
Can you help me understand what that shift represents, though?
Well, I think when we say biometrics, it's helpful to sometimes take a step back, because when we say biometrics, we're sort of adopting a language in which there's a set of kind of outputs from the human system that are understood, like its heart rate or something. And then there's a meaning structure, like we know what heart rate means. It's a biometric. It means, you know, something that you watch because it's diagnostic in a certain way, right? So biometrics are kind of medicalized numbers that come from the body. But what we see at the Quantified Self is lots and lots and lots of signals that people are sort of collecting off themselves and interpreting and making their own meaning out of. Biometrics is going to be a subset of that, right? And really the big story is all the different meanings that people make from these new senses and these new signals that the systems are generating. And I think in the end how that looks is the biometrics kind of get swamped in that story. And even the biometrics become something else. So you mentioned, I think the diabetes example is really good. What causes so much anxiety in these diabetes numbers? Well, there's many different things, from the physical experience to the, to the relationship that people have with the whole medical system of treating their diabetes. But one of the causes of that stress is attempting to optimize a number that's extremely difficult to optimize and is vulnerable to all kinds of fluctuations in the environment. And in
the glucose value.
Yeah, the glucose value, exactly. Now, in my conversations with diabetics, one of the ways they deal with that is that they give themselves a little break on the optimization algorithm, and they use it as a signal that can have more meanings. And they take a sort of very personal, high-touch, kind of craft approach to their number, rather than a sort of really instrumental optimization approach to their number. That's a cultural change in how we interpret those numbers, and a change in the locus of meaning of these systems that comes all the way back to the self. And that's where I think we're headed.
All right, so we have time for a couple questions, quickly, just probably two. So one right here.
I have a question that's related to the belt and knowing which way is north.
Yeah.
So for
Oh, we're going to get you on microphone so the people in the other areas can hear.
Okay, so this is related to the guy who figured
Yeah.
out where north was with his belt. We've known for a while that the sun doesn't rise and then doesn't set, but we move. But do you think we can feel the Earth, but we don't really feel the Earth move? So I guess I'm challenging, how much you can internalize sensing.
Would you like to feel the Earth move? We could
I think
probably
so.
arrange that.
I think I would like that. Can you work on that?
Really.
I'm just challenging that limit, like how much
Okay.
information we already have, and whether we still need those tools.
Yeah, I think it's the idea that we can take something you care about, and we can use numbers to capture it, to sense it, to see it in the ways that we can't normally, and then to respond to that, and maybe not just respond to the numbers, but actually to feel it in some other sense. And we can do that with all kinds of things. And these are kind of like what Jay Walker was calling ESP, extrasensory perceptions, or electronic sensory perceptions, where we're actually just trying to perceive things in ourselves in ways that we couldn't normally. And wearing, cochlear ear plants and contact lenses, these are actually steps in that same direction. So if you want to feel the acceleration of the Earth, we can do that.
Somebody else? Right there.
Hi. What would you suggest to physicians who are recalcitrant to the idea of patients bringing in their own data sets? I mean, how can we encourage the doctors to take advantage of the patient as an asset and not just reject them out of hand?
I don't know. I don't know what the doctors are resisting, really, but maybe Gary.
Well, we have had a lot of those conversations in some of our meetups because there's MDs come. And I think what I noticed, what I learned from watching those conversations is that not all doctors are alike, and doctors are embedded in systems, and the systems are more or less friendly to that sort of thing. I do think, so there's a lot of work to be done there, and I think there are doctors who are, in our community who are doing some of that work. I do think it helps to get the big picture, though, because a lot of medicine is based kind of on a storehouse of medical information, and there's a lot of investment in making that storehouse more efficient. But there's also a way in which that storehouse of information is rapidly becoming obsolete or sort of buried in the other information. A blood pressure measurement's a really good example. So you just have this case of sort of medical data that is supposed to be valid being swamped by other data. And also, we have this image, this mental model that data is sort of like raw when it's with the patient, and then it gets sort of validated, and then it's finally in a medical record, and that's when it's best. But what people are learning, obviously, when they look at their medical records, is actually the data is most valid when it's in a context, and i.e. when it's the person's data. And it actually loses validity often as it's aggregated into these formal structures. So I think having that big picture helps at least outline the landscape that doctors will be part of pretty soon.
And self-reported data, actually, so I know a lot of physicians are, and a lot of people in the healthcare world, research in general, are very suspicious of self-reported data. But I can point you to the research that shows self-reported data is as accurate as physician-reported data. So It's really just a certain amount of buy-in, I think, to the whole idea of data coming from a different source, God forbid, the patient. Somebody else? Right there. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. I didn't hear you said.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Yep. So just a comment on physician data. So it depends how the data comes in. So for example, a glucometer, which measures blood glucose at different times of day, physicians would love that kind of data. The person brings it in, the nurse or another staff member sort of clicks it in, and you get a nice graphing sort of time and means and averages of the data. And so physicians like that kind of stuff because it's clean, relatively clean data, and it's something that can result in not too much dialogue or time. So it's all about time now in physicians' offices. So if the data is easy, fast, quick, and help inform decision making, physicians like it. Physicians, I think, get worried about sort of noisy type of data, I think, that takes a lot of time.
Okay.
Do you guys have any comment on noisy data, like data that is just kind of a lot of junk in it?
Well, yes, and there's skills in collecting data, and lots of maybe the talks among the user groups is talking about how to collect better data, clean data, and what to do with the data. And this is, again, a skill set and a tool set that we don't really have right now. We don't have really good drag and drop statistical analysis tools. You get a lot of data, and to do something meaningful with it, to extract out some kind of pattern in a kind of reliable way is actually very difficult right now. It requires a certain level of expertise in the way that maybe doing typesetting was before desktop publishing came along. You know, and it was, or cartography. It took a really kind of specialized set of skills, but they became, through the use of tools, they became commonplace. They became something they teach in grade school, kerning, fonts, and all this kind of stuff. And I think the same thing can happen when people start working with big data and are required to, some people will gain a lot more familiarity with some aspects of that. That's just part of the basic literacy that we'll require for dealing with things. And I think noisy data is a problem, but that's a skill in terms of overcoming what you do about it is a skill that I think people learn to deal with.
Can I say one more thing about that? Is that it's a quote from somebody, Robin Barua, who participates in a lot of our meetups in the Bay Area. He said, you know, it's very, very hard to do science and make scientific discoveries. But it's also very hard not to learn something from making observations and analyzing them. You know, and in a sense, I think we're at the amazingness that you always learn something when you make these observations and get these numbers about yourself.
Well, listen, I want to thank you guys for catalyzing this community, for bringing this community together. Gary, you're writing a book on it, which is due out
soon.
I
won't put a number on that.
Before the next decade. But really, you guys have created a movement and helped bring this forward. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you.